Hello everybody. Today we're going to be starting with our unit on human biology, and we're going to be discussing over the next couple weeks the different systems in the body, focusing in on a few of the 11 systems. Today we're going to be focusing in on an overview of the body, discussing basic anatomy and physiology terms, and then we're going to focus in on the skeletal, muscular, and integumentary systems. These systems are primarily the support systems of the body. That's why we group them together today. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to be discussing basic anatomy and physiology terms, and that starts with structural organization. The body can be composed of many things and broken down into this level of structural organization. It is first broken down into organ systems, which are composed of organs, which are composed of tissues, which are composed of cells. If you study anatomy later on, either in high school or college, you'll find out that this structural organization can be broken down to an even more analytical state, going into the molecular biology of it. Earlier this year, you guys discussed cells, cell structure and function, and you guys discussed the cell theory. I just wanted to quickly review this because we will be relating the idea of cell function to the function of different structures within the body. So if you guys remember from earlier this year, all living things are made up of cells. Cells are the basic units of structure and function in living things, and new cells are produced from existing cells. These concepts, while we're not going to hardcore go into you need to know the cell theory, we will be applying these concepts to the structure and function of different body systems. Moving right up our structural organization list, you will see we have tissues. There are four major types of tissues. We have epithelial tissue, nervous tissue, connective tissue, and muscle tissue. Starting with epithelial tissue, it is primarily found on the lining of body structures. Nervous tissue is primarily used to carry information throughout the body. Connective tissue is used to support, protect, and insulate the body, and the muscle tissues are primarily used for movement. Going back to nervous system for just a minute, we're going to be discussing nervous tissue more in depth when we get into the nervous system in a couple days. With the nervous system, we have these things called neurons, which are information carriers. And we're going to be getting into the structure and function of those. So just so you know, we will be getting a little more in depth with some of these tissues. Here are some pictures of the different types of tissues so you can relate the structure of the tissue with the definition. Later on, we're going to be working on a lab where you're going to be looking at the microscopic views of these tissues, and you're going to be drawing pictures and explaining how these tissues look. So having a good idea of this now will help you with that lab later on. Homeostasis is the body's main way of maintaining constant internal conditions despite what's going on internally and externally in terms of environment. For example, if you have, say you're going on a trip and you're going to be climbing the Rockies or something, when you're climbing mountains, it's particularly cold because you're at high altitudes. When it's very cold outside, your body's internal conditions are maintained through homeostasis to keep you from dying of hypothermia. When we talked about enzymes earlier this year, you remember that temperature was one of the key things that denatured enzymes. Homeostasis helps to avoid the denaturement of enzymes, for example. Back to the climbing activity that we were discussing earlier, you can, even though it's cold outside, your body will maintain the temperature within your body to keep you warm so you won't die of hypothermia. Homeostasis can be explained very well through a feedback loop. This is an example of a feedback loop which can be broken into 5 key points. Your body is always in homeostasis, and then once an imbalance happens, typically neurologically or hormonally, but there are other stimulus that can produce variables. So the first thing that happens is there's a stimulus, which produces a change in your variable or your homeostasis, causing the imbalance. It's very viewed as a seesaw effect, how you want to be level, and then when an imbalance happens, it kind of shifts to one end or the other. The change is detected by a receptor or a sensory organ. These could be your senses of touch, smell, or other sensors such as sight. This information is inputted and sent along an afferent pathway to the control center, which is typically the brain, but in some cases it could also be nerves within the spinal cord. When we later on we're going to be discussing the nervous system and a reflex arc, and you'll find out that some stimuli can be detected and responded to without going to the brain right away. Back to the homeostasis feedback loop. From the control center, the information is sent along an efferent pathway to activate an effector or a change to the stimulus. The response of the effector feeds back to the influence magnitude of the stimulus and returns the variable to homeostasis. We're not going to discuss this very much more, but there are two types of homeostasis and feedback. It's called negative feedback and positive feedback. 9 out of 10, probably more than 9 out of 10 cases of homeostasis are negative feedback. Negative feedback and positive feedback are a little confusing in that they get into different concepts of negative feedback slows or stops the stimulus, where positive feedback would enhance it. There are only two instances where positive feedback happens, and that is in childbirth and in blood clotting. Like I said earlier, we're not going to be focusing in on that. I just want you guys to have an idea of what the homeostasis feedback loop looks like and how we can eventually relate this to different applications with the nervous system and different systems altogether. Moving on to our first body system, we're going to be discussing the skeletal system, which is the bones. The primary structures of the skeletal systems are bones, cartilage, ligaments, and tendons. Going to the function of the system, there are 5 major functions: to support the body, protect internal organs, movement, to store minerals, and to produce blood cells. These 5 functions, a lot of them are interchangeable. Well, not interchangeable, but they're used in other systems. For example, movement is used in the muscle system. Support of the body can be related back to the muscle system. That's why this presentation on these 3 systems really work together. There are 4 types of bones. We have long bones, short bones, flat bones, and irregular bones. You're not going to be responsible for knowing this, but I just thought it was kind of cool that way you could kind of break down the different bones each into the different classifications of them. When we get into the skeleton, there are 2 different types of skeletons. We have axial and appendicular. Big words, I know. Appendicular. With the axial skeleton, it consists of the skull and the vertebral column, which is the spine and the rib cage. The next slide has a picture of this, which will help you kind of visualize this concept. The appendicular skeleton consists of the arm and leg bones, as well as the pelvis and shoulder bones, also known as the pelvic and shoulder girdles. Again, we're not going to get into specifics on bones or specifics into any of the systems because we have a short amount of time to get through the entire body. Like I said, here's the picture. This is the axial skeleton. It's the skull and the vertebral column, including the ribs. And then here's a picture of the appendicular skeleton. The arms and legs, the pelvis, the shoulders. Put the 2 together, it creates the body. What do bones contain? Bones contain bone marrow, blood vessels, and various bone tissues. When we get into muscle tissues, there's a type of muscle tissue called skeletal tissue that we're going to be discussing later. Now, while that doesn't make sense now, you'll understand how skeletal muscle will relate to the skeletal system and how skeletal muscle is in fact a muscle, not a bone. Applying this knowledge of the skeletal system, we can discuss the topic of osteoporosis. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this, but maybe don't know exactly what it does. It usually happens around the age of 35, and it's when the reproduction of bone cells or bone replacement becomes gradually less efficient, sometimes to the point where you lose bone tissues. As I mentioned earlier, when we're going to be doing the different tissues in our lab activity, we're also going to be doing an observation of decalcified bones, and you're going to be able to relate this idea of osteoporosis and losing density of the tissue, the bone tissue, to the lab activity with the decalcified chicken bones. Alright, now I'm going to stop here and we'll pick up with the muscular system in our next presentation.